Tommy Tuberville sees a homeless man holding a Bible. What he does next moves the nation. The Alabama sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked sidewalks of downtown Montgomery as Senator Tommy Tuberville stepped out of his black SUV. It was a sweltering Tuesday afternoon in July, and the humidity hung in the air like a heavy blanket. He had just finished a contentious committee meeting about military spending, his mind still racing with budget figures and political maneuvering. As he walked toward the federal courthouse for his next appointment, something caught his eye. Sitting against the weathered brick wall of an old building, partially hidden in the shade of a fire escape, was a man who appeared to be in his 60s. His clothes were worn and faded, his gray beard unkempt, and his weathered hands clutched something against his chest. Tommy's first instinct was to walk past, as he had done countless times before when encountering the homeless population that seemed to grow larger each year in Montgomery. His security detail, walking a few steps behind, expected him to maintain his pace, but something made him pause. The man wasn't asking for money, he wasn't holding a cardboard sign or rattling a cup. Instead, he sat quietly, his eyes closed, holding what appeared to be a well-worn Bible. The leather cover was cracked and faded, held together with what looked like electrical tape. Despite the man's disheveled appearance, there was something peaceful about his demeanor that struck Tommy unexpectedly. "Senator, we need to keep moving," whispered Agent Morrison, his lead security officer. "Your meeting with Judge Harrison is in 10 minutes. Tommy held up a hand, signaling for a moment. He found himself walking toward the man, his polished dress shoes clicking against the concrete. As he approached, the man opened his eyes, bright blue eyes that seemed to hold a depth of experience that Tommy hadn't expected. "Excuse me," Tommy said, his voice carrying the slight drawl that had never left him despite decades in coaching and politics. "I couldn't help but notice you sitting here. Are you all right?" The man looked up, blinking in surprise. "Oh, hello there," he said, his voice hoarse but warm. "I'm fine. Thank you for asking. Just taking a moment to read and reflect." He gestured to the Bible in his hands. Tommy glanced at the book more closely. It was clearly ancient, its pages yellowed and edges frayed. "That looks like it's been well loved," he observed. A gentle smile crossed the man's weathered features. "My father gave this to me when I shipped out to Vietnam in 1968. Been with me through everything since." He paused, studying Tommy's face with those piercing blue eyes. "You look familiar. Do I know you from somewhere?" "I'm Tommy Tuberville," he replied, extending his hand. "I serve in the U.S. Senate." The man's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't seem intimidated. Instead, he reached out and shook Tommy's hand with a firm grip that spoke of years of hard labor. "Well, I'll be. I'm James Patterson, but most folks just call me Jimmy. Pleasure to meet you, Senator." Tommy found himself crouching down to Jimmy's eye level, something he hadn't planned to do. "Vietnam, you said? What branch?" "Army, 1st Infantry Division. Did 2 tours." Jimmy's voice carried a mixture of pride and pain that Tommy recognized from other veterans he'd encountered over the years. "Thank you for your service," Tommy said, and he meant it. "Are you getting the support you need from the VA?" Jimmy let out a dry chuckle. "That's a long story, Senator. Been fighting with them for years about my disability claim. In the meantime..." He gestured to his current situation with a shrug that seemed to say everything. Tommy felt something stir inside him, an emotion he couldn't quite place. Here was a man who had served his country, who clearly maintained his faith despite difficult circumstances, reduced to sitting on the streets of Montgomery while bureaucrats shuffled paperwork. "Senator," Agent Morrison's voice was more urgent now, "we really need to go." Tommy stood up, his mind racing. "Jimmy, I know this might sound strange, but would you be willing to meet with me later today? I'd like to hear more of your story." Jimmy looked surprised. "I appreciate the offer, Senator, but I don't want to be anybody's charity case or photo opportunity." The directness of the response caught Tommy off guard. but he respected it. "This isn't about that, I give you my word. There's a diner called Mel's about 6 blocks from here. Do you know it?" "I know it." Jimmy nodded. "Could you meet me there at 6 o'clock? My treat, and we can talk as long as you'd like." Jimmy studied Tommy's face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether this was genuine. Finally, he nodded slowly. "All right, Senator. 6 o'clock." As Tommy walked away toward his appointment, he found his mind wandering back to Jimmy throughout the rest of the afternoon. During his meeting with Judge Harrison, he caught himself thinking about the veteran sitting outside. During his conference call with campaign staffers about upcoming fundraising events, he wondered about Jimmy's story. By 5:30, Tommy found himself driving to Mel's Diner, a small, family-owned establishment that had been serving Montgomery for over 40 years. The red vinyl booths and checkered floor gave it the feel of a different era, when life seemed simpler and more straightforward. He arrived early and chose a booth in the back corner, away from the windows. At exactly 6 o'clock, Jimmy walked through the front door. He had clearly made an effort to clean up. His hair was combed, his beard trimmed, and though his clothes were still worn, they appeared freshly washed. "You came," Tommy said, standing to greet him. "A man keeps his word," Jimmy replied simply. "Besides, it's been a while since I had a good meal in a place like this." They settled into the booth, and Tommy watched as Jimmy's eyes took in the surroundings with appreciation. When the waitress, a middle-aged woman named Dolores, approached their table, she greeted Jimmy with familiarity. "Well, look who's here," she said, with a warm smile. "Haven't seen you in a while, Jimmy. How are you doing?" "Getting by, Dolores. This is Senator Tuberville. He's buying me dinner tonight." Dolores nodded respectfully at Tommy. "Well, that's mighty nice of you, Senator. Jimmy here is one of the good ones, always polite, never causes any trouble." After they ordered, Jimmy chose the meatloaf special with obvious delight. Tommy leaned back in his booth and asked the question that had been on his mind all afternoon. "Tell me your story, Jimmy. How did you end up here?" Jimmy was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing the edge of his coffee cup. "You sure you want to hear all of it? It's not a pretty tale." "I'm sure." And so Jimmy began to tell his story, his voice steady, but filled with the weight of hard-lived experience. Jimmy's story unfolded like a map of American struggles over the past 5 decades. Born in rural Alabama in 1949, he had grown up on a small farm with his parents and 3 siblings. Life was simple but hard. They grew cotton and raised a few head of cattle, living from season to season and praying for good weather and fair prices. "My daddy was a man of few words, but deep faith," Jimmy explained as their food arrived. "He worked that land from sunup to sundown, and every Sunday we were in church, rain or shine. That Bible I carry was his father's before it was his, and his father's before that." When Jimmy turned 18 in 1967, the Vietnam War was escalating rapidly. Rather than wait to be drafted, he enlisted, feeling it was his patriotic duty to serve. "Boot camp at Fort Benning was the hardest thing I'd ever done up to that point," Jimmy continued, taking a bite of the meatloaf and closing his eyes briefly in appreciation. "But it was nothing compared to what was waiting for us in Southeast Asia." Tommy listened intently as Jimmy described his first tour in Vietnam. The heat, the jungle, the constant threat of enemy fire, the loss of friends who were barely old enough to vote. Jimmy had served as a radio operator with the Big Red One, calling in airstrikes and coordinating troop movements while under fire. "We lost so many good boys over there." Jimmy's voice grew quiet. "Kids from small towns all over America, just like me. Some of them never even got to celebrate their 19th birthday." When Jimmy returned home in late 1969, America was a different country than the one he had left. Anti-war protests filled the streets, and returning veterans were often met with hostility rather than gratitude. I remember getting off the plane in San Francisco, Jimmy said, shaking his head. There were protesters there, calling us baby killers and worse. I couldn't understand it. We were just doing what our country asked us to do. Jimmy struggled to readjust to civilian life. The skills he had learned in the army, survival tactics, weapons handling, quick decision-making under pressure, didn't translate well to farming or factory work. He took a job at a textile mill in Montgomery, working night shifts and trying to forget the nightmares that plagued his sleep. That's when I met Linda. Jimmy's face softened for the first time since he had begun his story. She was working as a secretary at the mill office. Prettiest girl I'd ever seen, with auburn hair and green eyes that could light up a room. They married in 1971, and for a while life seemed to be getting better. Jimmy found work as a mechanic, Linda continued her job at the mill, and they saved money for a small house on the outskirts of town. In 1973, their daughter Sarah was born, followed by their son Michael in 1975. Those were the best years of my life, Jimmy said, his eyes distant with memory. Sarah was this little firecracker, always getting into everything, asking a million questions. Michael was quieter, more thoughtful, like his mother. We went to church every Sunday, had barbecues in the backyard, took family vacations to the Gulf Coast. But the trauma of war has a way of lingering, even when life seems to be moving forward. Jimmy began experiencing what doctors would later diagnose as post-traumatic stress disorder, though at the time it wasn't well understood or recognized. I started having these episodes, Jimmy explained, his voice becoming strained. Loud noises would set me off. I'd have flashbacks, nightmares. Sometimes I'd wake up thinking I was back in the jungle and Linda would have to calm me down. He began self-medicating with alcohol, a common coping mechanism for veterans of his generation. What started as a beer or two after work gradually escalated to drinking throughout the day. Linda tried to help me. She really did. She'd pour out bottles, hide my money, beg me to get help. But I was too proud, too stubborn. I thought I could handle it on my own. The drinking cost Jimmy his job at the garage, then another job at a construction company. Linda worked extra shifts to keep the family afloat, but the strain was enormous. The children, now in elementary school, began to see their father as unreliable, unpredictable. One night in 1984, Jimmy's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I came home drunk again. Sarah, she was about 11 then, asked me why I was always angry. I said some things I'll regret for the rest of my life. Linda finally had enough. She took the kids and went to her mother's place. Tommy found himself leaning forward, hanging on every word. The diner had grown quieter around them, the dinner crowd thinning out as evening approached. She filed for divorce 6 months later. Jimmy continued. Couldn't blame her. I was a mess. Lost the house, lost my family. Spent the next few years bouncing between jobs, living in cheap motels and boarding houses. The 1990s brought some stability when Jimmy found work with a construction crew that specialized in highway projects. The physical labor was demanding but satisfying, and his supervisor, a Vietnam veteran himself, understood Jimmy's struggles and was patient with his occasional bad days. I got sober for a while, Jimmy said. Joined AA, got my own apartment, started paying child support regularly. Sarah and Michael would visit sometimes. Things were looking up. But in 2001, Jimmy was working on a bridge project when a crane malfunction caused a load of steel beams to fall. He was struck in the back and leg, suffering injuries that would plague him for the rest of his life. Herniated discs, nerve damage, chronic pain. Jimmy listed his injuries matter-of-factly. Couldn't do construction work anymore. Applied for disability, both Social Security and through the VA for my service-connected PTSD and the new injuries. This began a bureaucratic nightmare that had continued for over 20 years. Forms were lost, Appointments were missed due to miscommunication. Medical evaluations were inconsistent. Jimmy would receive partial benefits for a while, then they would be cut off due to administrative errors. I'd get a letter saying my claim was approved, then 2 weeks later, another letter saying it was denied, Jimmy explained, his frustration evident even after all these years. Been through 4 different lawyers, none of them could make heads or tails of the system. Without steady income or benefits, Jimmy couldn't maintain housing. He moved in with friends when possible, stayed in shelters when necessary, and eventually found himself on the streets more often than not. Linda passed away in 2018, Jimmy said quietly. Cancer. Sarah called to let me know about the funeral. I wanted to go, but he gestured to his current appearance. I didn't want the kids to see me like this. Didn't want to make their grief about my problems. Tommy realized that his coffee had grown cold while listening to Jimmy's story. The complexity of the man's situation, military service, trauma, bureaucratic failures, family dissolution, painted a picture of how easily someone could fall through society's cracks despite their best efforts. Jimmy, Tommy said finally, what keeps you going? After everything you've been through, what gets you up each morning? Jimmy smiled slightly and patted the Bible that sat on the table beside his plate. Same thing that got my daddy up every morning, and his daddy before him. Faith that tomorrow might be better than today, and the belief that God has a plan, even when I can't see it. He paused, then continued. And this might sound strange, Senator, but I've met some good people living on the streets. Folks who'll share their last dollar with someone who needs it more. There's a kindness out here that you don't always see in the regular world. Tommy nodded, processing everything he had heard. What would it mean to you to get your disability benefits straightened out? It would mean I could get a small apartment, maybe reconnect with my grandchildren, Jimmy replied without hesitation. Sarah has 2 kids now, and Michael has 1. They've never really known their grandfather because I've been too ashamed to be part of their lives looking like this. As they prepared to leave the diner, Tommy made a decision that would change both of their lives in ways neither could imagine. The next morning, Tommy arrived at his Montgomery office with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in months. The usual stack of briefing papers, fundraising reports, and meeting requests sat waiting on his desk. But his mind was focused on Jimmy Patterson and the conversation from the night before. His chief of staff, Rebecca Martinez, knocked on his door at 8:30 sharp. A former Capitol Hill veteran who had worked for 3 different senators over her 15-year career, Rebecca was known for her efficiency and political acumen. Senator, we need to go over your schedule for the Armed Services Committee hearing next week, she began, settling into the chair across from his desk with her ever-present tablet and coffee mug. Rebecca, I need you to do something for me first, Tommy interrupted, his tone carrying an urgency that caught her attention. I want you to get me connected with whoever runs the VA Disability Claims Office here in Montgomery, today. Rebecca raised an eyebrow. Is this about a constituent case? Because we usually handle those through... This is different, Tommy said firmly. I met a Vietnam veteran yesterday, been fighting the system for over 20 years. I want to understand why cases like his fall through the cracks. So over the next 2 hours, Rebecca worked her way through the VA bureaucracy with the persistence of a seasoned political operative. By 10:30, she had arranged for Tommy to speak with Dr. Patricia Williams, the regional director of the Montgomery VA office. Dr. Williams, a soft-spoken woman in her 50s who had worked in Veterans Affairs for over 2 decades, agreed to meet with Tommy that afternoon. When she arrived at his office at 3 o'clock, she carried a thick folder and wore the expression of someone who had fielded many such inquiries from elected officials. Senator Tuberville, it's an honor to meet with you, she said, settling into the same chair Rebecca had occupied that morning. Rebecca mentioned you have concerns about our disability claims process. Tommy leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. Dr. Williams, I want to be direct with you. I've got a constituent, a Vietnam veteran, who's been jerked around by your system for 20 years. I want to know why. Dr. Williams nodded seriously. Without seeing the specific case, I can tell you that the complexity of our system has created significant challenges. We process over 1 million disability claims each year, and unfortunately, some cases fall through administrative cracks. This isn't about administrative cracks. Tommy's voice carried the firmness that had served him well as a football coach. This is about a man who served his country honorably and has been failed by the government he fought to protect. Dr. Williams opened her folder and pulled out several charts and statistics. Senator, I want you to understand the scope of what we're dealing with. In Alabama alone, we have over 400,000 veterans. Of those, approximately 180,000 receive some form of disability compensation. The average processing time for initial claims has been reduced from 262 days in 2013 to 125 days currently, but complex cases involving multiple conditions or incomplete documentation can take much longer. Tommy listened to the statistics, but his mind kept returning to Jimmy, sitting on that sidewalk, clutching his father's Bible. Dr. Williams, with all due respect, those numbers don't mean much to a man who's been sleeping on the streets for 2 decades. You're absolutely right, she admitted. Could you provide me with this veteran's information? I'd like to personally review his case file. Tommy had anticipated this request. He pulled out a notepad where he had written down the details Jimmy had provided the night before. James Patterson served 1968 to 1970 with the 1st Infantry Division. Filed disability claims for PTSD and service-connected back injuries from a 2001 workplace accident. Dr. Williams made notes as Tommy spoke. I can have someone pull his file today, but Senator, I need to be honest with you about something. Cases from the Vietnam era are particularly challenging because diagnostic criteria for PTSD weren't well established when these veterans first sought help. Many were misdiagnosed or not diagnosed at all. So you're telling me that because the government didn't understand PTSD 40 years ago, veterans today should pay the price? Not at all, Dr. Williams replied quickly. We've made significant improvements in how we handle PTSD claims, but older cases sometimes require complete re-evaluation, new examinations, and documentation that may no longer exist. Tommy stood up and walked to his office window, looking out at the Montgomery skyline. Somewhere in this city, Jimmy was probably looking for a place to spend the night, carrying that worn Bible and wondering if anyone cared about his situation. Dr. Williams, I'm going to ask you to do something for me. I want you to treat James Patterson's case as if he were your own father. I want you to personally oversee getting this resolved, and I want regular updates on the progress. Dr. Williams nodded. I can do that, Senator, but I want to manage expectations. Even with expedited processing, complex cases can take several months to fully resolve. Then we'll work together to make sure this one doesn't. Tommy replied. I also want to discuss broader reforms to prevent cases like this from happening in the future. After Dr. Williams left, Tommy called Jimmy's cell phone, a basic flip phone that Jimmy had mentioned he kept for emergencies and job searches. When Jimmy answered, Tommy could hear traffic noise in the background. Jimmy, it's Tommy Tuberville. I wanted to follow up on our conversation last night. Senator, I hope you don't think I was complaining or looking for special treatment. Jimmy's voice carried a note of concern. Not at all. I want you to know that I've already spoken with the regional VA director. She's going to personally review your case file and expedite the process. There was silence on the other end of the line for several seconds. Senator, you didn't have to do that. Yes, I did, Tommy replied firmly. You served this country with honor and you deserve better than what you've received from the system. I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything, but I do want to ask you for a favor. Would you be willing to meet with Dr. Williams next week? She wants to go through your entire case history and make sure nothing has been missed. Of course, whatever you need. Tommy arranged for the meeting to take place at his Montgomery office rather than at the VA facility. He sensed that Jimmy might feel more comfortable in neutral territory, and he wanted to be present to ensure that the conversation remained focused on solutions rather than excuses. The meeting took place the following Tuesday at 10 in the morning. Jimmy arrived 15 minutes early, wearing the same clean but worn clothes he had worn to dinner. Dr. Williams arrived promptly at 10, carrying a thick file folder and accompanied by 2 staff members. For the next 2 hours, they went through Jimmy's case history in detail. What emerged was a picture of bureaucratic confusion that had persisted for decades. His initial PTSD evaluation in 1987 had been conducted by a VA psychologist who was unfamiliar with combat trauma. His service records had been transferred between facilities multiple times, with some documents apparently lost in the process. The 2001 workplace injury had been evaluated separately from his military service, creating 2 different disability tracks that had never been properly coordinated. Appeals had been filed and processed without reference to earlier claims. At one point, Jimmy had been scheduled for a psychological evaluation that never took place because he had moved between filing the appeal and the appointment date, but no one had updated his address in the system. "Mr. Patterson," Dr. Williams said as they reviewed the final documents, "I owe you an apology. This case should never have been allowed to drag on for 20 years. We've failed you, and I'm committed to making this right." Jimmy nodded quietly. "I appreciate that, ma'am. I really do. Based on what I'm seeing here, you should have been receiving both compensation for your PTSD and for your service-connected back condition. I'm ordering immediate temporary benefits while we complete the formal reevaluation. You should receive your first payment within 2 weeks." Tommy watched Jimmy's reaction carefully. The man's hands trembled slightly as he processed what Dr. Williams had just told him. "How much are we talking about?" Jimmy asked quietly. Dr. Williams consulted her notes. "Based on preliminary assessment, you should be receiving approximately $2,800 per month, plus back pay for the years when benefits were improperly denied. The back pay calculation will take longer, but it could be substantial." Jimmy closed his eyes and took a deep breath. When he opened them again, Tommy saw tears threatening to spill over. 23 years, Jimmy whispered. 23 years I've been waiting for this." As the meeting concluded, Dr. Williams shook Jimmy's hand and promised to personally oversee his case until it was completely resolved. She also committed to using Jimmy's case as a model for identifying and correcting similar situations affecting other veterans. After Dr. Williams and her staff left, Tommy and Jimmy sat in the now quiet office. Outside, the sounds of Montgomery traffic provided a steady background hum. "Senator, I need to ask you something," Jimmy said finally. "Why did you do this for me? You don't know me from Adam. And helping one homeless veteran isn't going to win you any elections." Tommy considered the question carefully. "Jimmy, when I was coaching football, I used to tell my players that character isn't what you do when people are watching. It's what you do when no one is watching. When I saw you sitting there with your father's Bible, something told me that this was one of those moments." He paused, then continued. "But if I'm being completely honest, you've done more for me than I've done for you. You've reminded me why I wanted to serve in the Senate in the first place." Jimmy smiled. "Well, Senator, I think this might just be the beginning of something bigger than both of us." Neither man knew how prophetic those words would prove to be. Word of Tommy's intervention on Jimmy's behalf began to spread quietly through Montgomery's veteran community. It started with Dr. Williams mentioning the case to her staff as an example of how they needed to approach complex legacy claims. From there, It spread to social workers, VA counselors, and veteran service organizations throughout central Alabama. Within 2 weeks of Jimmy's meeting with Dr. Williams, Tommy's Montgomery office began receiving calls from other veterans with similar stories. Rebecca Martinez found herself coordinating with a growing list of constituents who had been struggling with denied or delayed disability claims. "Senator, we're up to 37 cases as of this morning," Rebecca reported during their weekly staff meeting. "And that's just in the last 10 days. Tommy looked up from the briefing papers he had been reviewing. 37? Are they all similar to Jimmy's situation?" "Variations on the same theme," Rebecca replied, consulting her notes. "Vietnam-era veterans mostly, but also some from Desert Storm and the early years in Afghanistan and Iraq. Long processing times, lost paperwork, inconsistent evaluations." Tommy's legislative director, Mark Stevens, leaned forward in his chair. "Senator, this could be an opportunity to push for broader VA reform legislation. If we're seeing this pattern in Alabama, it's likely happening nationwide." Before Tommy could respond, his phone rang. Rebecca answered it, spoke briefly with the caller, then looked up with a concerned expression. "Senator, that was Jim Morrison from the Montgomery Advertiser. He wants to speak with you about a story he's working on regarding VA disability claims. Says he's heard you've been personally intervening in cases." Tommy sighed. He had known that media attention was inevitable once word began to spread, but he had hoped to make more progress behind the scenes before the story became public. "Set up a meeting with Morrison for this afternoon," Tommy decided. "But first, I want to call Jimmy and let him know what's happening." An hour later, Tommy met Jimmy at the same diner where they had shared their first meal together. Jimmy looked different. Not dramatically so, but noticeably better. His clothes were newer, his hair professionally cut, and there was a lightness in his step that hadn't been there before. "The first disability payment came through yesterday," Jimmy explained as they sat down in their usual booth. $2,847. I stared at that ATM receipt for about 10 minutes. Couldn't believe it was real. "What's the first thing you did?" Tommy asked. Jimmy smiled. "Bought a phone card and called my daughter Sarah in Birmingham. First time we talked in over 2 years. His voice grew emotional. She cried when she heard my voice. Said she'd been praying that I was safe. "Are you going to see her?" "This weekend," Jimmy nodded. "She invited me for Sunday dinner to meet my grandchildren. I'm nervous as hell, but I'm going." Tommy felt a warmth spreading through his chest at seeing the transformation in Jimmy's demeanor. But he needed to discuss the growing media attention. "Jimmy, I need to let you know that reporters are starting to ask questions about your case. A journalist from the Montgomery Advertiser wants to do a story about VA reform, and your situation is likely to be mentioned." Jimmy's expression grew serious. "What kind of story?" "From what I understand, he wants to write about the broader issues with the VA disability system, but if you're not comfortable with the publicity..." "Senator," Jimmy interrupted, "if telling my story can help other veterans get the help they need, then I'm all for it." 2 hours later, Tommy sat across from Jim Morrison, a veteran reporter in his 50s who had covered Alabama politics for over 20 years. Morrison had a reputation for thorough, fair reporting, but Tommy knew that once this story appeared in print, it would likely be picked up by other media outlets. "Senator, I've been hearing some interesting things about your involvement with VA disability cases," Morrison began, his notebook and digital recorder on the table between them. "Can you tell me about James Patterson?" Tommy spent the next hour walking Morrison through Jimmy's case, being careful to stick to facts and avoid political rhetoric. He emphasized the systemic issues that had allowed such situations to persist and his commitment to finding solutions. "This isn't about politics," Tommy concluded. "This is about keeping faith with the men and women who served our country." Morrison nodded as he took notes. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Patterson if possible, and with Dr. Williams from the VA. I want to make sure I get all sides of this story. I'll provide you with their contact information, but I want to be clear. Jimmy's participation is entirely his choice." The story appeared on the front page of the Montgomery Advertiser 3 days later under the headline, "Senator's Personal Intervention Helps Veteran Get Long-Delayed Benefits." Morrison had done his homework, interviewing not only Jimmy and Dr. C. Williams, but also several other veterans who had contacted Tommy's office. The article painted a picture of systemic problems within the VA disability system while highlighting Tommy's hands-on approach to constituent services. But it was Jimmy's story that provided the emotional core of the piece. "I served my country for 2 years in Vietnam," Jimmy was quoted as saying. "When I came home, I just wanted the chance to live a normal life. It took 23 years and a senator who cared enough to make a phone call, but I finally got that chance." The reaction to the story was immediate and overwhelming. By noon on the day of publication, Tommy's office had received over 200 calls from veterans across Alabama. By the end of the week, that number had climbed to nearly 1,000. But the story didn't stay local. Within days, it had been picked up by the Associated Press, then by national news networks. Tommy found himself fielding calls from reporters in Washington, New York, and Los Angeles, all wanting to know more about his work with veterans. The attention wasn't universally positive. Some critics suggested that Tommy was using veterans' issues for political gain, pointing out that his intervention on behalf of Jimmy had come during an election year. Others argued that individual interventions, while helpful, didn't address the broader structural problems within the VA system. Tommy addressed these criticisms head-on during a press conference at his Montgomery office the following week. Standing behind a podium with Jimmy beside him, he spoke directly to the cameras. "Let me be clear about something," Tommy began, his voice carrying the authority he had developed over decades of public speaking. "James Patterson didn't ask for my help because he knew I was a senator. He didn't seek me out for political purposes. I met him by chance, sitting on a sidewalk in downtown Montgomery, holding his father's Bible and asking nothing from anyone." He paused, looking directly into the camera. "But when I learned about his situation, when I discovered that a man who had served his country with honor had been failed by the system for over 2 decades, I knew I had a choice. I could walk away and let someone else deal with it, or I could do what I was elected to do, serve the people of Alabama." Jimmy stepped forward to the microphone. Despite his nervousness about public speaking, his voice was steady and clear. "Senator Tuberville didn't help me because it was politically convenient," Jimmy said. "He helped me because it was the right thing to do. And if that's politics, then we need more politicians like him." The press conference was covered live by several Alabama television stations and streamed online by national news outlets. Video clips of Jimmy's statement were shared thousands of times on social media, often accompanied by comments from other veterans sharing their own experiences with the VA system. More importantly, the story began to generate action beyond Alabama's borders. Senators from other states started asking questions about VA disability processing in their own regions. The Senate Veterans Affairs Committee announced that it would hold hearings on administrative reforms within the VA. Veterans advocacy groups that had been pushing for system improvements suddenly found their calls being returned by congressional staff members. 3 weeks after the original story appeared in the Montgomery Advertiser, Tommy received a call that would take the entire situation to a new level. The caller identified himself as Jake Harrison, a producer for 60 Minutes. "Senator Tuberville," Harrison began, "we'd like to do a segment on your work with veterans' disability claims. We think this story has national significance, and we'd like to explore the broader implications of what you've uncovered in Alabama." Tommy agreed to the interview, but only on the condition that Jimmy be included as a central part of the story. "This isn't about me," he told Harrison. "It's about veterans like Jimmy Patterson who have been let down by the system." The 60 Minutes interview was scheduled for the following month, but word of CBS's interest spread quickly through Washington's political circles. Suddenly, Tommy found himself fielding calls from colleagues on both sides of the aisle who wanted to discuss veterans' issues. Senator Maria Gonzalez, a Democrat from California who served on the Veterans Affairs Committee, called personally to discuss possible bipartisan legislation. "Tommy, what you've done in Alabama is exactly the kind of constituent service that makes Congress work," she told him during their phone conversation. "But we need to think bigger. If we can identify the systemic problems that created situations like Mr. Patterson's, we might be able to prevent them from happening to future veterans." It was during this conversation that Tommy first began to envision what would eventually become the Veterans Advocacy and Accountability Act, a comprehensive piece of legislation that would reform VA disability processing and create new oversight mechanisms to prevent cases from falling through administrative cracks. But first, there was Jimmy's reunion with his family to consider. As Tommy prepared for increasing national attention, Jimmy prepared for something even more daunting: meeting his grandchildren for the first time. The drive from Montgomery to Birmingham on that Sunday morning felt like the longest 90 miles of Jimmy's life. He had borrowed a car from the VA's transportation program for disabled veterans, a service he hadn't known existed until Dr. Williams had mentioned it during his case review. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he navigated the familiar highways of his home state, passing cotton fields and small towns that held memories of a different life. In the passenger seat sat a bag of carefully chosen gifts, a wooden train set for his 7-year-old grandson Jake, a picture book about horses for 5-year-old Emma, and a photo album he had put together chronicling his military service and the early years of Sarah and Michael's childhood, photos he had somehow managed to keep through all his years of instability. The morning air was crisp for late August, and the radio played softly in the background. Jimmy found himself thinking about the last conversation he'd had with Sarah before Linda had taken the children and left. It had been over a heated dinner table argument about his drinking, with 11-year-old Sarah asking why Daddy was always so angry. The memory still stung after all these years. As he passed through the small town of Prattville, Jimmy pulled into a gas station to fuel up and gather his nerves. Inside the convenience store, he caught sight of himself in the security mirror behind the counter. He looked different than he had just weeks ago. Cleaner, healthier, with hope in his eyes instead of the hollow desperation that had marked his features for so many years. The young clerk, a teenager with acne and a friendly smile, nodded politely as Jimmy paid for his gas and a cup of coffee. "Have a good day, sir," the boy said, and Jimmy was struck by the simple courtesy. For years, people had either ignored him completely or looked at him with suspicion and disgust. Being treated like a normal person still felt strange. Back on the highway, Jimmy's mind wandered to the conversation he'd had with Tommy Tuberville the previous evening. They had met again at Mel's Diner, their weekly tradition now, and Tommy had asked about his plans for meeting the grandchildren. "Are you nervous?" Tommy had asked, cutting into his usual pie. "Terrified," Jimmy had admitted. "Or what if they don't like me? What if Sarah sees that I'm still the same broken man who drove her mother away?" Tommy had leaned forward, his expression serious. "Jimmy, you're not the same man. I've watched you over these past few weeks. You've got your dignity back, your hope back. Children are good judges of character. They'll see the real you." Now, as Birmingham's skyline came into view, Jimmy whispered a prayer, the same one he'd been saying since he was a child, the one his father had taught him. "Lord, give me strength for what lies ahead, and help me be worthy of the blessings you've given me." Sarah lived in a modest suburban neighborhood in Hoover, just outside Birmingham. The houses were small but well maintained, with neat lawns and minivans in driveways, the kind of middle-class American dream that Jimmy had once thought he might achieve for his own family. As he turned onto Maple Street, his heart began to pound. Number 1247 was a yellow two-story house with white shutters and a small front porch decorated with potted flowers. A child's bicycle lay on its side in the front yard, and Jimmy could hear the sound of laughter coming from the backyard. He parked at the curb and sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel and trying to steady his breathing. As he walked up the sidewalk, carrying his gifts and wearing the new clothes he had bought with his first disability payment, khakis, a button-down shirt and dress shoes that actually fit properly, Jimmy noticed the curtains move in the front window. His heart pounded as he approached the front door. The door opened before he could knock. Sarah stood there, 38 years old now, her auburn hair showing the first hints of grey, her green eyes, so much like her mother's, filled with tears. She was wearing a simple sundress and an apron that read, "World's Greatest Mom." And for a moment, Jimmy was transported back to the kitchen of their old house, watching Linda cook Sunday dinner while Sarah played at her feet. "Daddy," she whispered. And then she was in his arms, holding him tightly as they both cried on her front porch. "I'm sorry," Jimmy kept repeating. "I'm so sorry for all the years, for everything I put you and your mother through." "You're here now," Sarah said, pulling back to look at his face. She reached up and touched his cheek as if to make sure he was real. "That's what matters. You're here now." Inside the house, Jimmy was struck by the warmth and comfort of the space. Family photos covered the mantelpiece and walls, Sarah's wedding, the children's school pictures, vacation snapshots. He noticed that there were no photos of him and felt a pang of sadness for all the memories he had missed. Sarah's husband, David, emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel. He was a tall, thin man with kind eyes and prematurely grey hair, wearing jeans and a polo shirt. Jimmy had been nervous about meeting his son-in-law, unsure how the man would react to his wife's long-absent father. "David, this is my dad," Sarah said, her voice still shaky with emotion. David extended his hand without hesitation. "Mr. Patterson, it's an honor to finally meet you. Sarah's told me so much about you over the years." His handshake was firm and warm, and his smile seemed genuine. "Please call me Jimmy," he replied. "And thank you for taking such good care of my daughter. I can see she's happy." "She's an amazing woman," David said simply. "You raised her right, Jimmy." The words hit Jimmy harder than he'd expected. "I'm not sure I can take credit for that. Sarah's mother did most of the raising, especially the important parts." "From what Sarah's told me," David said gently, "you taught her some pretty important lessons too, about resilience, about never giving up hope, about the importance of faith." Before Jimmy could respond, two small faces appeared around the corner from the kitchen, peeking cautiously at the stranger in their living room. Sarah knelt down and beckoned to them. "Kids, come here. There's someone very special I want you to meet." Jake, the 7-year-old, approached first. He had his mother's green eyes and his father's serious demeanor, with sandy brown hair and a gap-toothed smile. He looked Jimmy up and down with the frank curiosity of childhood. "This is your grandfather," Sarah said gently. "This is my daddy." Emma, the 5-year-old, hung back behind her brother. She had curly auburn hair, like her mother and grandmother, and she clutched a stuffed horse tightly in her small arms. Jimmy knelt down to their eye level, the same way Tommy had done with him on that Montgomery sidewalk weeks earlier. "Hello there," he said softly. "I've been looking forward to meeting you both for a very long time." Jake studied Jimmy with intense curiosity. "Are you really a soldier?" he asked. "I was, a long time ago. I served in a place called Vietnam, before your mommy was even born." "Did you fight bad guys?" Emma piped up, her shyness momentarily overcome by curiosity. Jimmy smiled gently. "I tried to help keep people safe. Sometimes that meant fighting, but mostly it meant trying to take care of the other soldiers who were with me. making sure they could come home to their families. "Why haven't we ever met you before?" Jake asked with the directness that only children possess. Sarah started to intervene, but Jimmy held up a gentle hand. "That's a fair question, Jake. I've been sick for a long time, not with a cold or fever, but sick in my heart and in my mind. Sometimes when grown-ups get that kind of sick, they think they need to stay away from the people they love so they don't make them sick too. It took me a long time to get better." Jake nodded seriously, as if this explanation made perfect sense to him. "Are you better now?" "I'm getting better every day," Jimmy replied, "and being here with you and your sister and your parents is helping me get better faster." Emma stepped forward shyly. "Grandpa Jimmy, do you want to see my room? I have horses on my walls." The simple invitation brought fresh tears to Jimmy's eyes. "I would love to see your room, sweetheart." As Emma led him up the stairs, chattering about her horse collection and her kindergarten class, Jimmy caught Sarah's eye. She was crying again, but smiling through her tears. The house tour continued for the next hour. Emma showed off her horse-themed bedroom, complete with a rocking horse and horse posters covering every available wall space. Jake demonstrated his baseball card collection and his model trains, which filled an entire corner of his room. Jimmy listened attentively to every detail, asking questions and showing genuine interest in their hobbies and achievements. In Jake's room, Jimmy noticed a bookshelf filled with children's books about military history and American heroes. "Your mummy told me you like to read about soldiers," he said. "Yeah. I want to be in the army when I grow up, just like you were." Jake's eyes shone with enthusiasm. Jimmy sat down on the edge of the bed and looked seriously at his grandson. "That's a noble calling, Jake. But I want you to know that there are lots of ways to serve your country and help people. Your daddy serves people by helping them with their taxes and their money. Your mommy serves people by teaching children. Being a soldier is just one way." "But you were a soldier," Jake pointed out. "I was, and I'm proud of my service. But I'm also proud of your mommy for becoming a teacher, and your daddy for being such a good man, and you for being such a smart, thoughtful boy." They returned downstairs to find David putting the finishing touches on Sunday dinner. The dining room table was set with Sarah's good china, and the smell of pot roast filled the air. Jimmy recognized it immediately as his mother's recipe, the same one Linda had learned to make during their early married years. "I hope you don't mind," Sarah said, noticing his expression. "I called Grandma Patterson for the recipe after we talked. I thought you might like something familiar." Jimmy had to excuse himself to the bathroom to compose himself. His mother had died while he was living on the streets, and he had missed her funeral, another regret that weighed heavily on his heart. When he returned, they gathered around the table. David asked Jimmy if he would like to say grace, and Jimmy found himself speaking words he hadn't spoken in years. "Heavenly Father, we thank you for this food, for this family, and for second chances. We thank you for bringing us together again, and we ask for your guidance as we move forward. Help us to make up for lost time and to build new memories together. Amen." "Amen," the family echoed. The meal was everything Jimmy had remembered and more. Sarah had prepared all his favorite foods: the pot roast with vegetables, homemade biscuits, green beans cooked with bacon, and sweet potato pie for dessert. The conversation flowed easily, with Jake and Emma chattering about school and their friends, David asking Jimmy about his military service, and Sarah filling in the details of their family life over the past few years. "Tell us about the senator," Emma said suddenly. "Mommy says he's your friend." Jimmy smiled. "Senator Tuberville is a very special man. He didn't have to help me, but he chose to anyway. Sometimes God puts people in our lives exactly when we need them most." "Is he famous?" Jake asked. "He's pretty well known, yes, but more importantly, he's a good man who cares about people." "Can we meet him sometime?" Emma asked. Jimmy looked at Sarah questioningly. "I don't see why not, if he has time and if your parents say it's okay." After dinner, they moved to the living room, where Jimmy presented his gifts. Jake's eyes lit up when he saw the wooden train set, meticulously crafted by a local artisan with Jimmy's disability money. Emma squealed with delight over the horsebook, which featured beautiful illustrations and stories about wild mustangs. But it was the photo album that generated the most emotion. Jimmy had spent hours organizing the pictures, writing captions in his careful handwriting. There were photos of him in his army uniform, young and serious-faced, pictures of Sarah as a baby, learning to walk, blowing out birthday candles. Images of Michael playing Little League baseball and building sandcastles at Gulf Shores. "Look, there's Mommy!" Emma exclaimed, pointing to a picture of 3-year-old Sarah sitting on Jimmy's shoulders at a county fair. "And there's Uncle Michael," Jake added, studying a photo of a 10-year-old Michael proudly displaying a fish he had caught during a father-son camping trip. Sarah turned the pages slowly, her eyes filled with tears. "I remember this day," she said, pointing to a photo of the family gathered around a Christmas tree. "I must have been 6 or 7. You bought me that doll with the yellow dress." "Chatty Cathy," Jimmy said softly. "You carried that doll everywhere for months." "I still have her," Sarah admitted, "in a box in the attic." As the afternoon wore on, Jimmy found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't in decades. The children warmed up to him quickly, with Emma climbing onto his lap to look at more pictures, and Jake peppering him with questions about military life and his time in Vietnam. "Did you ever get scared?" Jake asked. Jimmy considered the question carefully. "Yes, I got scared sometimes. All soldiers do. But you know what helped me?" "What?" Jimmy pulled out his father's Bible and showed it to Jake. "This. My daddy gave it to me before I left for the war, and it reminded me that I wasn't alone, even in the scariest times." Jake ran his small fingers over the worn leather cover. "It looks really old. It belonged to my daddy, and his daddy before him. Maybe someday, if you want it, and if it's okay with your parents, it could belong to you too." Jake's eyes widened. "Really? Really? But that's a decision for another day, when you're older." As evening approached, Jimmy knew it was time to leave. The drive back to Montgomery was long, and he didn't want to overstay his welcome on this first visit, but saying goodbye proved more difficult than he had anticipated. Emma clung to his leg as he prepared to leave. "When will you come back, Grandpa Jimmy?" "How about next Sunday?" he said, looking at Sarah for confirmation. "Every Sunday," Sarah said firmly. "You're part of this family, Dad. You always have been." David shook Jimmy's hand again. "You're welcome here anytime, Jimmy. Thank you for coming today. It means more to Sarah than you know." Jake hugged him tightly. "Next time, can you bring more pictures and maybe tell us more Army stories?" "Absolutely," Jimmy promised. Sarah walked him to the car, and they stood in the driveway for a moment as the sun began to set over Birmingham's skyline. The air was cooling, and the sounds of suburban Sunday evening, lawn mowers, children playing, families gathering, created a peaceful backdrop for their conversation. "Dad," Sarah said, taking his hands in hers, "I need you to know something. I never stopped loving you, even during the worst times. And I never stopped praying that someday you'd find your way back to us." Jimmy's voice was thick with emotion. "I thought about calling so many times over the years, but I was ashamed. I didn't want you and Michael to see what I'd become. You were sick, Daddy. You were hurt, and you didn't know how to get help. That doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you human." They talked for nearly another hour as the children played in the backyard and David cleaned up the dinner dishes. Sarah told him about her job as an elementary school teacher, about the challenges and rewards of shaping young minds. She spoke about her marriage to David, how they had met at church and bonded over their shared faith and values. She also told him about the dark years after Linda's death, when she had struggled with anger and grief over her father's absence. "I had to forgive you," she said simply, Not because you asked for it, but because I needed to let go of the anger to be the mother and wife I wanted to be. I don't deserve your forgiveness, Jimmy said. None of us deserve forgiveness, Dad. That's what makes it grace. There was something else Sarah needed to tell him. Michael is coming for dinner next Sunday. He wants to see you, but he's still carrying some anger about the past. He might not be as ready to move forward as I am. Jimmy nodded. His son had been 12 when Linda took the children and left, old enough to understand what was happening and to blame his father for the family's dissolution. Michael had seen more of Jimmy's worst behavior than Sarah had absorbed more of the chaos and disappointment. I understand, Jimmy said. I'll take whatever he's willing to give me, even if it's anger. At least it means he cares enough to feel something. And as he drove back toward Montgomery, Jimmy's heart was fuller than it had been in years. The visit had exceeded his wildest hopes. The children had accepted him without reservation, David had been welcoming and kind, and Sarah had opened her heart and home with a generosity that reminded him of her mother. He thought about the week ahead, his regular appointment with Dr. Williams to discuss his ongoing treatment, his weekly dinner with Tommy Tuberville, his part-time job at the hardware store that he had started just days earlier. His life was taking shape in ways he had never imagined possible. But most importantly, he was a grandfather now, not just in name, but in reality. Jake and Emma had claimed him as their own with the easy acceptance of childhood, and he had a chance to be part of their lives as they grew up. He could teach them about their family history, share stories about their grandmother Linda, and perhaps most importantly, show them that people could overcome their mistakes and find redemption. Meanwhile, in Montgomery, Tommy Tuberville was putting the finishing touches on his speech for the Veterans Affairs Committee hearing that was scheduled for the following week. The success of Jimmy's case had opened doors that Tommy never could have anticipated, and he was determined to use his platform to advocate for comprehensive reform of the VA system. His phone rang as he worked at his kitchen table, papers spread around him, and his laptop opened to a draft of proposed legislation. "Tommy, it's Maria Gonzalez," came the voice of his colleague from California. "I just wanted to touch base about the hearing next week. We've had over 24 senators express interest in attending, which is unprecedented for a Veterans Affairs Subcommittee meeting." Tommy leaned back in his chair. "That's good news. The more attention we can bring to these issues, the better. I've also heard from several veteran advocacy groups who want to testify. They're all citing the Patterson case as evidence of systemic problems. You've really struck a nerve with this story." "It's not my story," Tommy said. "It's Jimmy's story, and the story of thousands of other veterans who've been failed by the system. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time to help one of them. Well, whatever you want to call it, it's having an impact. I've already had 3 Republicans approach me about co-sponsor state." In the passenger seat sat a bag of carefully chosen gifts, a wooden train set for his 7-year-old grandson Jake, a picture book about horses for 5-year-old Emma, and a photo album he had put together chronicling his military service in the early years of Sarah and Michael's childhood, photos he had somehow managed to keep through all his years of instability. Sarah lived in a modest suburban neighborhood in Hoover, just outside Birmingham. As Jimmy pulled into her driveway, he saw the curtains move in the front window. His heart pounded as he walked up the sidewalk, carrying his gifts and wearing the new clothes he had bought with his first disability payment. Khakis, a button-down shirt, and dress shoes that actually fit properly. The front door opened before he could knock. Sarah stood there, 38 years old now, her auburn hair showing the first hints of grey, her green eyes, so much like her mother's, filled with tears. "Daddy," she whispered, and then she was in his arms, holding him tightly as they both cried on her front porch. "I'm sorry," Jimmy kept repeating. "I'm so sorry for all the years, for everything I put you and your mother through." "You're here now," Sarah said, pulling back to look at his face. That's what matters. You're here now. Inside the house, Jimmy met his son-in-law, David, a soft-spoken man who worked as an accountant and had been patient enough to marry a woman whose father was absent from her life. David shook Jimmy's hand warmly and said simply, "Sarah's told me a lot about you. Welcome home." Then came the moment Jimmy had been both anticipating and dreading, meeting his grandchildren. Jake, an energetic 7-year-old with his mother's green eyes and his father's serious demeanor, approached cautiously. Emma, 5 years old with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile, hung back behind her brother. "Kids," Sarah said gently, "this is your grandfather. This is my daddy." Jake studied Jimmy with the intense curiosity of childhood. "Are you really a soldier?" he asked. Jimmy knelt down to Jake's eye level, the same way Tommy had done with him on that Montgomery sidewalk weeks earlier. "I was, a long time ago. I served in a place called Vietnam." "Did you fight bad guys?" Emma piped up, her shyness overcome by curiosity. "I tried to help keep people safe," Jimmy replied carefully. "Sometimes that meant fighting, but mostly it meant trying to take care of the other soldiers who were with me." The tension in the room gradually eased as the day progressed. They shared a meal of pot roast and vegetables. Sarah had remembered her father's favorite meal from childhood. Jimmy told sanitized stories about his military service, focusing on the camaraderie and the friendships rather than the trauma. He played trains with Jake and read picture books to Emma, but it was during a quiet moment when the children were playing in the backyard and Sarah was cleaning dishes that the most important conversation took place. "Daddy," Sarah said as Jimmy dried the plates she handed to him, "I need you to know something. I never stopped loving you, even during the worst times, and I never stopped praying that someday you'd find your way back to us." Jimmy's hands stilled on the dish towel. "I thought about calling so many times over the years, but I was ashamed. I didn't want you and Michael to see what I'd become. You were sick, Daddy. You were hurt and you didn't know how to get help. That doesn't make you a bad person." They talked for nearly an hour as the children played outside. Sarah told him about her marriage to David, about her job as an elementary school teacher, about the challenges of raising children while worrying about a father she hadn't heard from in years. Jimmy listened, really listened, in a way he hadn't been able to do during the worst years of his drinking and instability. "There's something else I need to tell you," Sarah said as their conversation wound down. "Michael is coming for dinner next Sunday. He wants to see you, but he's still angry about some things." Jimmy nodded. His son had been 12 when Linda took the children and left. Those are formative years, and Michael had seen more of his father's worst behavior than Sarah had. "I understand," Jimmy said. "I'll take whatever he's willing to give me, even if it's anger. At least it means he cares enough to feel something." As the afternoon drew to a close, Jimmy prepared to drive back to Montgomery. He had found a small efficiency apartment near downtown. Nothing fancy, but clean and safe, with enough room for a bed, a small table, and a bookshelf where his father's Bible sat alongside some new books he had started reading. Jake and Emma hugged their grandfather goodbye with the easy affection of children who hadn't yet learned to hold grudges. David shook his hand again and said, "You're welcome here anytime, Jimmy. Family is family." Sarah walked him to his car, and they stood in the driveway for a moment as the sun began to set over Birmingham's skyline. "Daddy, can I ask you something? How did this all happen? How did you go from sleeping on the streets to having your benefits and an apartment and being back in our lives?" Jimmy smiled and thought about Tommy Tuberville, about that moment when a busy senator had chosen to stop and talk to a homeless veteran holding a Bible. "I met someone who reminded me that sometimes angels don't have wings, sweetheart. Sometimes they just have the courage to care about a stranger." Meanwhile, in Montgomery, Tommy was preparing for the biggest media appearance of his political career. The 60 Minutes interview was scheduled for the following week, and his communications team had been working around the clock to prepare him for the kinds of questions he might face. But Tommy's mind kept wandering to broader implications of what had started with a chance encounter on a Montgomery sidewalk. His office had now handled over 1,200 veteran disability cases, with a success rate of nearly 80%. The Veterans Administration had announced new initiatives to review legacy claims and improve processing times. Other senators had introduced related legislation in their own states. Yet Tommy knew that the real measure of success wasn't in the legislation or the media attention, or even the number of cases his office had resolved. The real measure was sitting in a diner in Birmingham, reading picture books to grandchildren he had never expected to meet. The 60 Minutes interview took place on a Tuesday afternoon in Tommy's Montgomery office. Correspondent Anderson Cooper and his crew spent 4 hours filming, interviewing both Tommy and Jimmy, and capturing footage of the downtown area where their first meeting had taken place. Cooper was particularly interested in the moment when Tommy had decided to approach Jimmy on the sidewalk. "Senator," Cooper asked during the interview, "you walk past homeless individuals probably dozens of times each month in your work here in Montgomery and in Washington. What was different about Mr. Patterson?" Tommy considered the question carefully. The cameras were rolling, and he knew that his answer would be seen by millions of people. But more importantly, he knew that Jimmy was sitting just off camera, listening to every word. "Anderson, I wish I could give you some profound answer about recognizing something special in Jimmy's eyes, or having some kind of premonition that this encounter would change both of our lives," Tommy began. "But the truth is simpler and maybe more important than that. He was sitting there quietly, holding his father's Bible, not asking anyone for anything. He had dignity in a situation where dignity is hard to come by, and I realized that if I walked past him without at least saying hello, I'd be walking past everything I claimed to believe in about service and compassion." Cooper turned to Jimmy. "Mr. Patterson, when Senator Tuberville first approached you, did you have any idea who he was?" Jimmy shook his head. "Not at first, no. But when he told me he was a senator, I'll be honest, I was skeptical. I'd been disappointed by politicians before, had my hopes raised and then dashed. But there was something different about the way he talked to me. He looked me in the eye like I was a human being, not just a problem to be solved." The interview covered Jimmy's military service, his struggles with PTSD and the VA system, and his long journey back to his family. It touched on the broader implications for veterans' care and the legislative reforms that Tommy was now championing in the Senate, but it was the final segment that would become the most widely shared clip from the interview. Cooper had asked both men to return to the sidewalk where they had first met, and the cameras captured them, standing in the same spot where their lives had intersected weeks earlier. "Mr. Patterson," Cooper said, "you mentioned that you believe Senator Tuberville was sent into your life for a reason. Do you still feel that way?" Jimmy looked at Tommy, then back at the camera. "I believe that God puts people in our path when we need them most. I needed someone to see me as more than just a homeless veteran, and maybe, just maybe, the senator needed to be reminded of why he got into public service in the first place." Cooper turned to Tommy. "Senator, has this experience changed you?" Tommy was quiet for a moment, looking down at the sidewalk where Jimmy had been sitting that July afternoon. "Jimmy said something to me early on that stuck with me. He said that he'd met some of the kindest people while living on the streets, folks who would share their last dollar with someone who needed it more. I think what he was telling me is that character isn't about what you have or what position you hold. It's about what you do when you have the chance to help someone who can't help you back." The 60 Minutes segment aired 3 weeks later to an audience of over 12 million viewers. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Tommy's office received thousands of calls and emails from viewers, many of them veterans or family members of veterans sharing their own stories. But more importantly, the story sparked action at the national level. Within a month of the broadcast, the Veterans Advocacy and Accountability Act had been introduced in both the House and Senate with bipartisan support. The legislation included provisions for expedited review of legacy disability claims, improved coordination between VA offices, and enhanced oversight to prevent cases from falling through administrative cracks. Jimmy's story became a rallying point for veterans advocacy groups across the country. He was invited to testify before the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, where he spoke eloquently about the need for systemic reform while maintaining the dignity and grace that had first caught Tommy's attention. "Senators," Jimmy said during his testimony, "I don't want your pity, and I don't want to be seen as a victim. I want to be part of the solution. Every day that a veteran waits for benefits they've earned is a day that our country fails to keep faith with those who served." Said he, the legislation passed both houses of Congress with overwhelming support and was signed into law by the president in a ceremony attended by Tommy, Jimmy, and Sarah's family. In his remarks at the signing, the president noted that sometimes the most important changes in our country begin not with grand gestures or political speeches, but with one person choosing to care about another. The day, 6 months after that chance encounter on a Montgomery sidewalk, Tommy and Jimmy found themselves back at Mel's diner for what had become a regular monthly dinner. Jimmy looked transformed, not just physically, though the steady income and stable housing had obviously improved his health and appearance. The change was deeper than that. There was a peace in his eyes that spoke of a man who had found his way home, not just to his family, but to himself. "You know what the best part is?" Jimmy said as they shared pie after their meal. "Jake wants to be a soldier when he grows up. Says he wants to serve his country like his grandpa did." Tommy smiled. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that serving your country comes in many forms. Sometimes it means putting on a uniform and carrying a rifle. Sometimes it means being a teacher like his mother or a senator like you. But it always means caring about something bigger than yourself." Jimmy paused, then continued. "I also told him that if he does decide to serve in the military, he can be proud, knowing that when he comes home, the system will be there to take care of him. Because of what we've done together, Jake and his generation won't have to fight the same battles I fought." As they prepared to leave the diner, Tommy reflected on how much had changed since that hot July afternoon. The Veterans Advocacy and Accountability Act was already showing results. Processing times for disability claims had been reduced, coordination between VA offices had improved, and most importantly, fewer veterans were falling through the cracks. But perhaps the most significant change was in Tommy himself. The chance encounter with Jimmy had reminded him of why he had wanted to serve in public office in the first place. It had reconnected him with the values that had guided him as a coach and as a man, the importance of seeing individuals rather than statistics, of taking action rather than just talking about problems, and of understanding that real leadership sometimes means simply having the courage to care about a stranger. As they walked out of Mel's diner together, Jimmy carrying his father's Bible and Tommy thinking about the committee hearing he had the next day, neither man spoke about the national attention their story had generated or the legislation that now bore both of their names in spirit, if not in law. Instead, they talked about Jake's upcoming baseball game, about Sarah's promotion to vice principal at her school, and about Michael's gradual warming toward his father during their Sunday dinners. They talked about the small, everyday victories that make up a life rebuilt and relationships restored. Because in the end, that's what their story had always been about. Not the grand gestures or political achievements, but the simple recognition that every person has worth and dignity, regardless of their circumstances. It was about the understanding that sometimes the most important thing a person in power can do is stop, listen, and care enough to help another human being find their way home. The nation had been moved by their story, but for Tommy and Jimmy, the real victory was much simpler and infinitely more precious. It was the sound of a grandfather reading bedtime stories to grandchildren he had never expected to meet, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that when those children grew up, they would live in a country that kept faith with those who served. As they parted ways in the diner's parking lot, Jimmy shook Tommy's hand with the same firm grip he had offered that first day on the Montgomery sidewalk. "Thank you," Jimmy said simply. "Thank you," Tommy replied. And they both knew that the gratitude ran in both directions. Behind them, the lights of Montgomery twinkled in the gathering darkness, a city where a chance encounter between two strangers had reminded an entire nation of the power of individual compassion and the importance of keeping promises to those who serve. It was a reminder that sometimes the most profound changes begin not with legislation or speeches, but with the simple decision to see another person's humanity and to act on the better angels of our nature. In homes across America, veterans who had been struggling with their own battles against bureaucracy and indifference took hope from Jimmy Patterson's story. They saw in it the promise that their service mattered, that their sacrifices were valued, and that their country had not forgotten them. And in a small efficiency apartment in Montgomery, a Vietnam veteran sat at his kitchen table, writing letters to other homeless veterans, sharing resources and encouragement, carrying forward the kindness that had been shown to him. Because Jimmy Patterson understood something that Tommy Tuberville had learned that July afternoon. We are all connected by our shared humanity, and we all have the power to change someone else's life simply by choosing to care. The Bible that had belonged to Jimmy's father and his father before him sat open on the table beside the letters. Its pages were worn and its binding cracked, but its message remained as true as ever, that we are called to love our neighbors as ourselves, to care for the least among us, and to never give up hope that tomorrow can be better than today. It was a message that had sustained Jimmy through the darkest nights of his homelessness, had motivated Tommy to act with compassion rather than convenience, and had inspired a nation to remember its obligations to those who serve. And as the lights of Montgomery slowly dimmed toward midnight, that ancient message continued to work its quiet magic in the hearts of all who had been touched by this unlikely friendship between a senator and a soldier. A reminder that in a world often divided by politics and differences, we are united by our capacity for love, kindness, and hope. The end